In my first video, I talked about the most popular questions that I get from my clients. When should I take the SAT or the ACT? In this video, I'll address the other most popular question that I get, which test should I take? Students often come to me saying that they know which test they want to take, but then as we work together, we realize that they might be a better candidate for the other test. Make sure you don't waste precious practice time on the test that ultimately might not be the best match for you. There are students who might be potential candidates for both, but there are definitely students who only want to think about one test versus the other. There are many factors that go into making that decision. Let's get into the pros and cons of each test and how to decide which one you ultimately want to consider. Both the SAT and ACT will contain reading, grammar, and math sections. The ACT also includes a science section, and both tests have an optional essay section. But even though the section titles are the same, each test presents that material in a different way. Every student has a different opinion on each test. Still, the general consensus from the majority of my students goes something like this. Many find that the questions on the SAT are harder. For example, a reading question on the SAT really wants you to read between the lines or find supporting evidence for something somewhere else in the passage. A math question also wants you to go beyond pure computation and think more conceptually. The questions are more in-depth and want you to analyze things more fully. In comparison, many students find that the ACT questions are easier. A reading question is often much more transparent and just wants you to find a detail from the passage. A math question might only want you to plug a number into a formula or isolate a variable. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that the ACT is automatically the test that you should take. Let's delve further into each section. Overall, the reading sections on both the SAT and the ACT are testing the same innate skill, understanding what you read. But beyond that, there are many differences. For the most part, ACT reading questions are myopic or based on very specific details. SAT questions are holistic or based on the passage as a whole. There are certainly exceptions to this, but for the most part, ACT reading questions are all about the small details. SAT reading questions require more inference. For example, ACT reading questions often look something like this. What does Christopher typically eat for breakfast on a Thursday? Or which of the following details happened last chronologically? Not too tough. The questions don't require any major critical thinking. However, what makes them difficult is that they deal with one very specific detail from the passage. This is the nature of many ACT reading questions. They want you to remember a needle in a haystack. The question itself is fairly straightforward. However, it can be difficult to recall where you saw that certain piece of information. SAT reading questions are usually more in-depth than that. They go beyond just asking you to find a random detail. They want you to read between the lines or find support for something somewhere else in the passage. Also, the SAT includes reading questions that want you to analyze data from a chart or a graph. The question will ask how that data relates to the information in the passage. These questions will not appear on the ACT reading. So the reading questions on the ACT, for the most part, are more transparent. However, because of that, you have to move much more quickly. I'll get into more detail with this later in the video, but timing is often the main struggle for students on the ACT reading. That said, if you are a fast reader, and if you have a good eye for details, you might find that you are a good candidate for the ACT reading sections. If you need a little more time on your side to digest the information from the passage, the SAT might be a better fit. The grammar content is very similar between the two tests. The ACT gets into a little more detail of complicated verb tense and how to use certain forms of adjectives and adverbs, but for the most part, the SAT and the ACT are testing the same rules of grammar, like punctuation, pronouns, etc. However, just like the reading, timing is the name of the game. Let's look at the breakdown of each grammar section in a little more detail. The grammar section on the SAT contains 44 questions in 35 minutes. The ACT grammar section contains 75 questions in 45 minutes. At first glance, this might seem a little daunting. Your reaction might be that the ACT wants you to move much faster, and it does. Still, these numbers don't give the entire picture. Let's pause for a moment to talk about the two main types of grammar questions that you'll see. The first type of grammar question is what I'll call a quick fix question. For these questions, all you have to do is fix a word or fix a piece of punctuation. You can handle them fairly quickly. The second type of question might look something like this. Should the writer add or delete certain information from the passage? where is the best place to insert the following sentence? Suppose the writer's goal had been blah, 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 blah. Would this essay fulfill that goal? For these questions, you need to understand the passage as a whole. Let's call these the organization questions. On the SAT, you have a fairly even split for each type of question. You'll see roughly the same amount of quick fix questions as organization questions. On the ACT, you will have many more of the quick fix questions. So it's true that the ACT wants you to move more quickly and answer 75 grammar questions within 45 minutes. However, the majority of those questions will be the quick fix questions, which take far less time than the organization questions. So this is where the ACT grammar brain is similar to the ACT reading brain. Students have the potential to do well if they can read quickly, decipher information, and move right along. The SAT might be a better match for students who need a little more time to process the information more carefully. The SAT does not dive into advanced topics of math the way the ACT does. It mostly pulls from Algebra 1 and Algebra 2 topics. So there will be a whole lot of questions dealing with things like the equation of a line, FOIL and factoring, and systems of equations. So the topics themselves aren't so advanced, which is good. But the question often requires more critical thinking and wants you to go beyond strict computation. For example, they not only want you to know the equation of a line, they want you to know how that equation can be used to model a real-world scenario. So on SAT math questions, the topics themselves are easier, but the nature of the question is more difficult. For the ACT, the opposite is true. The questions pull from more advanced topics of math. However, the question itself is fairly straightforward. For example, an ACT math question might ask you to rewrite this logarithm. Log A, B equals C. This can be rewritten as a to the power of c equals b. If you have gotten up to this topic in high school, this is not a hard logarithm question. However, many of my students have never seen this topic in school before. It's something you would see in a more advanced math class, but not in early algebra. And this is the nature of many ACT math questions. The topic itself is harder, but the question itself is easier. So if you've covered that given topic in school before, the question itself is often not so bad. However, the ACT does pull from more advanced topics of Algebra 2 and pre-calculus. Check this out in an upcoming video where I'll get into much more detail about how there is a major discrepancy between what is taught in high school and what is fair game on the test. This is especially relevant on the ACT. Also, not only does the ACT cover more advanced topics of math, it also tests much more random topics of math. The ACT does not have a finite list of what topics are considered fair game from test to test. It constantly changes. So say what you will about the SAT, it is much more predictable. You'll pretty much always see the same list of topics. There are some exceptions to this. For example, they recently started asking about box and whisker plots. Last year, they snuck in a question dealing with a reference triangle, and those topics had never appeared on the SAT before. But for the SAT, this is a rarity. For the most part, the SAT is not going to surprise you in terms of which topics are fair game. Other than maybe one or two questions for each round, you can anticipate what topics are in play from test to test. They're fairly consistent. This is not the case with the ACT. The first 40 out of 60 math questions are fairly predictable, but once you get to the last 20 questions or so, there is no guarantee of what topics are fair game. The ACT will put in many topics that have never appeared on the test before. So it's not just that the last 20 math questions on the ACT are testing more advanced topics, which they are. It's that they are so difficult to anticipate, especially for those last 10 questions where it really becomes luck of the draw. Now, this doesn't necessarily matter for everyone, depending where they are in the scoring bracket. For example, I have students starting with a score in the 15 to 20 range, and they just want to break into the mid-20s. For these students, their potential points are not coming from the last 15 questions anyway. They have many points to earn in the first 40 questions without worrying about those random topics at the end. However, this is very relevant for a student with an ACT math score around a 28 or a 29 who wants to break the 30 mark. This means that they are earning their points on questions 1 through 40, and their potential points are now coming from those random topics at the end. This is where things can get a little dicey, since it's so hard to predict what topics you'll see at the end of a section. So, you might be well suited for the SAT if you're more comfortable with Algebra 1 and Algebra 2 topics, and if you need a little more time on your side. You might be well suited for ACT math if you have covered more advanced topics of math in school and if you could work through the sections a little more quickly. And just a few other differences between the two math sections. The ACT lets you use a calculator on the math section. The SAT lets you use one on one math section, but not on another. This intimidates certain students, but it's not a huge deal. Most questions on the no calculator section are conceptual. They don't involve any serious computation, so that shouldn't be such a big factor. Another difference is that the SAT gives a reference table at the top of each section. It doesn't include everything they expect you to know, but it does include a nice portion of geometry formulas to help you out. The ACT won't list any formulas at the top. Also, the ACT only includes multiple choice math questions. The SAT includes some multiple choice questions, but then some student-produced response questions. So for example, if the answer is 17, you actually have to bubble in the digits 1, 7. You're not picking an answer from a list of choices. So obviously, a major difference between the tests is that the ACT has a science section and the SAT does not. The biggest misconception about the ACT science section is that it is testing science. The questions are not testing science knowledge, or at least not the way that you learn it in a science class. They're not going to ask you things like the atomic number of carbon or ask you to break down the steps of photosynthesis. Instead, the science sections on the ACT want you to analyze an experiment and extrapolate based on certain trends within the data. Now, of the 40 science questions, maybe 3 of them will require actual scientific knowledge. If they do, they will typically be asking for something very basic, like knowing that the charge of a proton is positive, or knowing that an acid has a lower pH than a base. But for the most part, that's not what these questions want from you. They're more about scientific reasoning. Again, this is where the ACT brain comes in. It's not a section that you could really study for, per se. There's no list of rules of science topics that are fair game on the test. Instead, the science section is a good match for students who can interpret information quickly. The questions want you to predict a result based on patterns within the data, interpret how different scientists with conflicting viewpoints might approach a certain experiment, or simply just read a chart and a graph. My students are often shocked when a science question literally just wants them to read a point off of a chart or a graph. They ask me, wait, that's all I had to do? Yes! Again, this is not your high school science test. So, I find that the ACT is a good test for students who can think quickly. Or, put more bluntly, the ACT is an information regurgitation test. The questions want you to get in, get what you need, and get out. But above all, keep moving. The SAT wants you to think a bit more. The questions are more in-depth, but you have more time on your side. So above all, the biggest factor to help you decide between the two tests is timing. On one end of the spectrum, I have students who are able to finish every ACT section comfortably within the time. In the middle, there are students who might finish down to the wire, or just have to guess on a few questions. No big deal. But on the other end of the spectrum, there are students who struggle considerably with the timing factor on the ACT. In these cases, I am talking about students who can only finish somewhere in the range of 60 to 70% of the questions within the given time. So before you do anything, take a baseline ACT test. Check out my upcoming video where I get into more details of which prep books you should buy. I'll go over where to find the most authentic tests. When you sit for your baseline ACT, be hard on yourself to do it under authentic timed conditions and in one sitting. So if you run out of time, you must move on to the next section. You certainly want to see what your scores are, but even more important, you want to see how the timing goes. If you finish all of the questions comfortably, or even most of them, great. However, if you struggle to finish more than 20 to 30% of a section, that's another story. There's no exact number for this, but I often suggest that my students do not take the ACT if they're only able to answer 55 out of 75 grammar questions, 40 out of 60 math questions, 30 out of 40 reading questions, and 30 out of 40 science questions. At that point, it doesn't matter what rules you study. You can memorize every math formula that there is. But if you're not able to answer upwards of 30% of a section, the ACT might not be the right test for you. To further help you decide, College Board and the ACT release concordance tables that compare SAT to ACT scores. These tables show how certain scores on the SAT correspond to certain scores on the ACT. For example, an ACT score of 19 roughly compares to an SAT score of 1000. An ACT score of 26 roughly compares to an SAT score of 1250. Now, these are not exact numbers, and they update the tables every so often. Give them a web search to find the latest version that you can. Still, it is a very valuable tool to check how your practice SAT numbers compare to your practice ACT numbers. The concordance chart is a great way to help you decide which test you want to think about. Given all of the above, you might decide that you want to go ahead with both tests. Many of my students decide to do this, especially if their numbers on the concordance chart are comparable between the two tests. In that case, we might decide that it's worth it to take a shot at both. However, this comes with the caveat, not to exhaust yourself. Usually, the tests are spaced out fairly well throughout the year. Try to take advantage of that as much as you can. For example, if you're making a pitch towards the February ACT, you have a solid month after that to then focus on the March SAT. That gives you a good window in between to switch mental gears. But this can become a potential issue in December and June. Those are the 2 months when the tests are offered on consecutive Saturdays. The first Saturday of the month is the SAT, and the second Saturday is the ACT. I do not suggest taking both exams on back-to-back Saturdays. If you decide to take both exams, try to space them out a little more than that. This not only helps with the exhaustion factor, but it also helps you have tunnel vision to just work on one type of test. Work backwards from a certain test date and use the month leading into it to practice just those types of sections. In other words, do not practice from an SAT during 1 week and an ACT during the next week. Especially with what we talked about before. The internal clock for each test is so different. You want to get used to the timing and pacing of just one test. Focus on just that type of test for the stretch of time leading into that exam. And if you decide to take both tests, try to space them out as much as you can. And check out my first video where I get into much more detail about the timing of the tests throughout the year. So, there are many factors that go into deciding between the SAT and the ACT. This is a little overly simplified, but for the most part, ACT questions are easier, but the timing is much more challenging. It also contains more advanced math and that funky science section. SAT questions are harder, but the timing is typically more generous. It also does not get into as advanced topics of math. Again, the ACT is an information regurgitation test. Get in, get what you need, get out. It is good for students who can interpret data very quickly. The SAT might be a better match for a student who needs a little more time to process information. Take a baseline of each. After you do, see how your scores compare using the concordance tables. See how the timing goes, especially on the ACT. And above all, just think about how you feel during each test. Your immediate reaction to the ACT might be something like, wow, these questions are easier. Or you might say, holy cow, I hate the science section. Both of which are very popular responses. Based on these factors, you can pick the test that is the best match for you. And if you decide to proceed with both, great. Just make sure to space them out as much as you can so that you don't overwhelm yourself. I hope you found this video informative. If you found any part of it helpful, please give it a like, share it with friends, leave a comment down below with any questions or thoughts, and become a subscriber so that you can follow the most up-to-date changes to the test season. I'll see you next time. And remember, plan your work, work your plan.